Charlemagne the Great led over the Frankish peoples and led over what would eventually create modern-day Europe, creating both Germany, specifically the Holy Roman Empire, and France. But however, including that, there was also a third kingdom which many tend to forget about, which was Middle Francia. And it was this middle kingdom, which of course did not last very long. However, from my research into this, I believe that its consequences of its mere existence are actually incredibly significant when we try to understand the history of Europe moving past this point and even today. So first I would like to present a map. So with the end of Charlemagne's reign, he had three sons and they were all very contentious with each other. They were all trying to take power over the Carolingian Empire. And with that, Charlemagne decided to divide his kingdom into three. And specifically, what came out of it was this. So what we end up with is West Francia, which is now France. We end up with East Francia, which is of course now Germany, and we end up with this strange kingdom right here, which was Middle Francia. And Middle Francia is unique in that it spans across a continent and spans across a lot of cultures which aren't very similar. Modern day France is of course very diverse. It has a lot of different cultures and groups of people that speak different languages which aren't necessarily the same as French or are different dialects of French. It's not all Paris, it's not all standard French. However, in Germany as well is also, of course, has a lot of different dialects of German. However, everyone here roughly could consider themselves French. Everyone here could roughly consider themselves German. This includes the Netherlands, it includes Belgium, Luxembourg, Switzerland, Italy. It's a very diverse kingdom. So it's strange geography, which is, being in between France and Germany, made it so that it didn't really last very long. So after the reign of King Lothar, it was split again into this area right here, which was called Lotharingia. So right in between Germany and France. So that would be the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Alsace-Lorraine. And then right here became a second kingdom subdivided, was Provence, which is where the Occitan language is from. It's also where, if anyone has ever heard of the troubadours, that's where they were from. And northern Italy, so the Kingdom of Italy, as it was called back then. So you get this subdivision, and then from there, you end up with many, many treaties afterward where these kingdoms end up getting divided. So you end up with France taking all of this over, and then you end up with Germany taking all of this over, and then you end up with all these wars being fought over who gets what. And it was these wars, and it was this initial division into a middle kingdom, which ultimately cemented this region as being culturally distinct from France and Germany. It is my belief that if this kingdom had never existed, there probably would not be a Dutch nation. There would not. Dutch could be a language that still exists, but it might not be as widespread. It might be a more obscure language like Frisian, as opposed to being the nation of an entire country. For all we know, maybe the Netherlands could have been absorbed into Germany, or into France even. But it is because of this initial separation that it could develop into its own thing. And not only that, but also Provence. We need to consider the fact that Provence and Provençal, Occitan, these are languages that are not French. They are very similar to French, but they're not French. They are very distinct from French, and people who speak the languages do not believe that it's a dialect of French. They believe it's a whole different language. Um, and this goes back to this because that kingdom of Provence, it lasted far longer than Lotharingia did, and as a result, developed into its own culture, ended up more connected to Italy, whereas France was geographically separated from Italy, so it borrowed more from Italy. And we see a lot of the conflict between the French and the Occitan for centuries. We end up with crusades being waged against perceived heretics living in the area. We see the forced subjugation of that people. We see a lot of oppression being forced onto the Occitan, and a forceful integration into French culture and society, because ultimately Provence, what it was and still is, completely culturally distinct from what we call France today. They are very distinct. And ultimately, that goes back to this kingdom, because it was this kingdom that allowed for it to develop into its own culture. If it had been just a part of France immediately after Charlemagne's division, if he had just done two kingdoms, I do not think Provence would have developed into such a strong, vibrant culture as opposed to French. I believe it would have been much more culturally similar to French. And I don't think it would have developed as distinctly. I think it would have been much more closely similar to France. And then also we have, of course, Italy. So Italy, I believe this separation between northern and southern Italy, I mean, ultimately it would go back to Charlemagne, but the fact that this kingdom even existed, it does cement the cultural distinction from northern Italy to southern Italy, a distinction which still exists today and has been very difficult to reconcile for Italians. When Italy was actually fully reunited by Garibaldi, those distinctions were still very, very prevalent. And it was actually under Mussolini that he uh, explicitly tried to end these separations and absorb everyone from north to south into one Italian culture, language, government, etc., etc. But and I think the most important thing that I will be talking about is that the fact that this even exists, this right here, became a very disputed territory, and entire wars were fought over this territory right here, Alsace-Lorraine, and it's because of that initial separation. Because of that initial separation, it wasn't entirely clear if if Lotharingia can't survive, who gets it? Is it German or is it French? That was a conflict that lasted literal centuries and was only really resolved with World War II. Um, it was heavily disputed. It was uh, under the German kingdom in the 1870s all the way to World War One. It was a part of Germany, and then it was a part of France, and then it was a part of Germany again, and then now it is a part of France for the most part. With some of these regions here would be a part of Germany. Of course, right here, Switzerland, which, of course, this division also would contribute to the cultural uniqueness of Switzerland, which is that Switzerland is a place which speaks French in some parts, German in other parts, Italian in some parts, and yet, and even some languages that don't exist outside, like Romansh. Like Switzerland, this tiny country, is very culturally distinct and is filled with all these different cultures. And ultimately, that's because of all this dispute over this area right here. So I just wanted to come out and make a video about this because this has been something that I thought was very interesting. And I think it's something that's very unexplored. I haven't really heard many people talk about the importance or the significance of Middle Francia. So anyway, thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed, and goodbye.